Right, welcome everybody. You can see people are starting to join. This is an event put on by the Enterprise Architecture Specialist Group of BCS. I'm one of the organising committee of the BCS Enterprise Architecture Specialist Group. Sadly, the chair, Colin, has had a work commitment that he needed to attend to. So I think you've just got me from the organising committee tonight, and I'm also speaking. So bit of a one-man show, I'm afraid, this evening. But I'm sure some of my colleagues from the organising committee will be on future events in the future. So those of you who don't know who the BCS EA group are, we're a group that's really passionate about enterprise architecture, and I guess not just enterprise architecture, but also closely related architecture, technology architecture, disciplines like solution architecture, security architecture, business architecture, etc. So we're quite a broad church of the architects within the technology profession, because there is no other specialist group that covers architecture. So even though we're called enterprise architecture, it's quite a broad definition of EA, and all encompassing really of the other sort of related architecture facets within technology and business architecture. So welcome to the webinar. I can see we've got quite a few people on now, so we'll get started. But if you've got any questions about the BCS Enterprise Architecture Specialist Group, please feel free to put those in the chat or Q&A, and we'll try and get onto those either this evening, or we'll get back to you on that when we can. So with that, I'm going to start presenting. Let me just get my deck up. Great. So as per the sort of billing and the advertised, it's about sustainability in architecture. So this is a talk that I give variations of quite regularly. This one I'm specifically dialing up the sort of importance to architects, and I'll give you a bit of my background in architecture shortly. But essentially, we're going to be covering what's the driving force behind this. And I think the driving force behind this is principally, and quite a punchy statement here, I guess, that if your architectures aren't enabling the sustainable and circular economy by 2030, you'll likely go out of business. If you are a business, if you're a government or public, a not-for-profit, then you won't be as relevant. But yeah, the bold statement, and this is based not just on my pet theory, but also other things, other research I'm doing, and I'll explain why I think that punchy statement's justified throughout this presentation. But that's the hook statement, I suppose, for why architecture is important to our organizations when it comes to sustainability, because it's a living, breathing sort of existential thing for organizations if they don't get on top of this. It's not a nice to have, it's not a bolt on, it's not a tick box exercise, it's not a compliance thing. This is crucial to how we operate our organizations going forwards. And so architects also are ideally placed, I think, to lead the charge on the required transition that we all need to make, that we all need to go through. This talk's going to focus quite a lot on the technology side, but I think equally architects can also think about the business and technology architecture that underpins their organizations and leads them to a more sustainable future. And I'll touch a little bit on that, but this talk isn't going to major on that. This talk is going to talk more about the sustainability of technology and how do we reduce the impact. And unfortunately, sustainability isn't quite enough. We're going to need to strive for regenerative, and I'll talk about what that means shortly. But that's too big a leap for most organizations to take in one step. So I think most organizations are going to need to get to grips with sustainability first, and then push towards regenerative. The most successful organizations, I truly believe, will be regenerative by the 2030s. So why am I qualified to talk about this? Some of you may recognize me from BCS activities. Those of you who are regular BCS attendees of events, I've been involved in the enterprise architecture and other BCS specialist groups for many years now. And I've been a chartered IT professional, BCS chartered IT professional since 2011. So I passionately believe in BCS. I think it's a great organization and look to do as much as I can through it. But my background then, so my background is a blend, I suppose, of science and computer science from a very early age. I was sort of torn going through the education system as to whether I'd go into the sciences or IT, and IT won. And then after university, a computer science degree, then started off life in software engineering roles, infrastructure engineering, developer, full stack dev, before it was even sort of coined as a term. And then I was fortunate to end up at an energy and environmental consultancy where I built data and web application solutions for quite a few years. And that was a great organization to work for, and really gave me a passion for the sustainability space. Unfortunately, due to the financial crisis of 2008, the projects I was working on, a lot of them got cancelled or got postponed or whatever, and I had to take a bit of a leap into, I suppose, from gamekeeper to poacher, and went and worked in the energy sector for a while. But that was fascinating, and has really helped me understand a lot of the challenges we have around the energy sector. And I'll talk a bit about carbon aware and grid aware technology later on in the talk. And then I went and worked in lots of other sectors, which has given me quite a rounded view of architecture and technology strategy and software engineering in many different sectors. I've been a chief architect at a couple of organizations, and since 2020 have been leading a community and podcast called Architect Tomorrow. And Architect Tomorrow has worked with BCS. It's also worked with likes of ISA, the International Association of Software Architects. So Architect Tomorrow is a bit of a sort of independent podcasting community that I've been running for a while now. And what am I doing now? I'm now fortunate to be leading sustainable technology and sustainable architecture at Scott Logic. And Scott Logic are a B Corp. So for those of you who don't know what B Corporation is, it's an organization that also looks at the kind of greater good, the social mission beyond just the financial mission. So yeah, do look up B Corp if you've not seen that already. And we're a software and data engineering consultancy primarily. So I appreciate that people will be all over the page when it comes to your understanding of this space. And so what I just wanted to start off doing is just a little bit of terminology, just so that everyone has the same sort of grounding, and I'm not using sort of words and phrases that are alien. To start with, let's talk about the sort of elephant in the room, I suppose. And I will do my best to try and stay apolitical. I won't try and get into the politics of all this, because I know sustainability can very rapidly go quite political, and I will try and steer clear of that and stay fairly fact-based. But what we have to start with is the reality that we find ourselves in, as you know, in the modern economies that you know, most of us on this call will be in, particularly in the West and the Northern Hemisphere. We've been somewhat addicted to economic growth. And sure, you know, I'm not going to bash economic growth here. It pays for, you know, loans for future big investment projects and so on and so forth. And so without financial growth, our current, you know, economies and democracies don't particularly function. However, it's really, we're over-indexing on one particular aspect of society, you know, the economics. And actually, for those of you who've not seen it, I highly recommend looking at Donut Economics, which is by Kate Rayworth. There's a fantastic TED talk that she gives, and this picture on the right-hand side is one of her visuals. And basically, it's this point I've made at the bottom here: the externalities, you know, the other factors of our economy are not built into just focusing on GDP, you know, economic growth. We're missing a whole load of, you know, metrics and KPIs and indicators that we should be thinking about when it comes to sort of, you know, sustainability and fair societies. And so the reason I like the donut picture is it looks at that sort of broader picture. You know, on here you've got income and work. They're just one you know, facet. So the economy is on here, but it's just one facet of the wider sort of set of priorities around, you know, health and food and energy and so on and so forth. And what the donut is about is the inner ring is basically saying, what do we need to provide for a, you know, a just, fair civilization for everyone on the planet? You know, that's the sort of minimum we need to provide humanity, as it were, and society to function and be fair and give people access to these things. And on the outside of the ring is what's known as the ecological ceiling. So what's our kind of budget, if you like, for you know, resource use or land use or you know, other impacts that we unfortunately have on the world around us. You know, how do we stay within this Goldilocks zone, essentially, of providing enough for people to have enough and not overshoot and not use so much that we're using more than the planet can, you know, can provide for us each year that we're on it. And there's an interesting thing each year about overshoot. You know, there's a point in the year where we basically we have overshot our, you know, resource usage for the year. And I think, and people can correct me in the comments if I'm wrong here, but I think it's normally around sort of April, May, sort of like normally around this sort of time of year that we've unfortunately hit the point where we've already used the resources of the planet, if we're going to have a sustainable future. So it's essentially what we're not doing right now is thinking about the bigger picture. We're very much focused on financials, and so that's just something to sort of bear in mind, is that we're not really focused on the bigger view. And this leads me to a bit of reality check around how are we operating. And so we've been through big transitions in how our organizations are operated before, through the industrial era and so on and so forth. And I think if you look back, and I appreciate this is, I'm going to scratch the surface on some quite sensitive topics here, and I don't mean to belittle them, but I'm just using them here to sort of illustrate a point, which is, back in the 1400s to the 1800s or early 19th century, we were exploiting people. We had slave labor, we had exploitative working practices, in many forms, and we stopped that. We moved on from that, and we moved, to a system where we weren't exploiting people. Unfortunately, of course, we still have some of that going on today with issues with modern slavery. But that aside, the exploitative era is largely, in the rearview mirror. I'm not saying it's completely gone away, but we've then moved on to sort of an extractive or industrial era. And then I think some organizations, some parts of the world have realized they need to move to more of a conserving approach to conserving the resources that they use as part of operating. And then other organizations have gone further than that, and they're looking to be sustainable. And what I'm plotting a course here on this slide is, I think what we're on the path towards is realizing that we have to be restorative. We have to restore nature. We don't live in isolation. The human society is a system that sits on top of the ecological and natural systems of the world. So we have to realize that we have to live in symbiosis and harmony with those things if we're to be sustainable and have successful long-term organizations. And so I think what we're going to see is people realizing that sustainability is like the baseline that they need to operate at, but those organizations that are able to restorative and regenerative will see further improvements to how they operate. Because why do I say this? The days of being able to extract virgin materials, so raw materials out of the ground, and just constantly use new resources are numbered.
Oliver?
Sorry, yep.
I'm sorry to interrupt you mid-flow, but
yep.
Chat is blowing up at the moment.
Okay.
Are you supposed to be sharing any slides at the moment? Because everyone's asking.
Oh, am I not sharing?
Yeah.
Sorry, I thought I was sharing. Thank you for jumping in. What's going on here then? Is that working?
Yeah, we can see the initial slide.
I did that earlier, so apologies, folks. I will quickly, I guess I'll quickly canter through the ones I missed. Is that still working? Yeah, cool. I'm seeing some thumbs up. So this is the one I was just talking about, this sort of picture from exploitative times through to sort of future, hopefully regenerative times. But let me just skip through. The previous slide was quite important. So the kind of one that talked about financial growth being the only indicator, and then donor economics. And like I say, go and check out Kate Rayworth's work. The TED Talk is very good. And Andreas, sorry, you've got a, let's just check. Okay, I'm going to assume that that's just previously about the screen, lack of screen share, but someone put in the chat if not. And then just quickly zooming back. So yeah, this is me, and then yeah, kind of just a quick recap. The main point is architects need to push towards a sustainable future. We're ideally placed to lead that transition, and sustainability isn't enough. So those are the slides that hopefully you've now got the chance to see. So so yes, I'll just quickly kind of move on, recap, and then move on from this point. So so yeah, I think what this is talking about is that there's been this evolution of how we've operated our organizations, and how what's the expectation of society of our organization. Well, we're going to have to move on from just being purely extractive and pulling natural resources out the ground. We're going to have to find ways of reusing and recycling those things. And that naturally builds me onto this picture here, which hopefully some of you have seen, which is the circular economy. And this is by the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. And I look at this and I think, I wonder if this provides a blueprint for, our reference architectures going forward. Is this kind of, a reference architecture for the ecosystems we need to build? So no longer do we have this sort of linear extractive process that starts with raw materials and then producing things and then amending in landfill at the end of that process. But we have things where we're looking at repairing, reusing and remanufacturing, and then finally recycling, because just to continue to use virgin materials, natural materials in their raw form each time we're building something is just not going to work going forward. We're already running out of certain types of materials. I mean, helium's an interesting example. I hadn't realized until recently that helium is such a small element that it escapes the Earth's atmosphere. So every time we fill balloons for kids' parties, it's fun. I don't want to be a killjoy, but unfortunately, we're essentially releasing the only source of helium that we have, which is held underground. That we are continuing to find new sources of helium at the moment, but once we run those underground sources out, there is no more helium. It's produced in a star. It's not something we can reproduce on the Earth with current technology. So there are real reasons why we have to start preserving some of these materials and these elements, because they're finite, and we won't be able to continue to kind of to use them unless we find ways of remanufacturing. So some other terminology before I move on to the meat of the presentation. So hopefully many of you are familiar with terms like greenhouse gas protocol, but the GHG, greenhouse gas protocol, but I don't like to make assumptions here. I will make some references to that. So that's why I wanted to bring that up. CO2 or CO2e is carbon dioxide equivalent. So there's lots to talk about CO2, but CO2 isn't the only greenhouse gas. There's methane. There's other gases that are actually involved in air conditioning and other parts of the technology infrastructure that we build. Potentially have quite alarming warming effects. And then the other point I wanted to raise is this point around carbon tunnel vision. It's a bit like what I was saying before, where we're in danger of being overly focused on financial growth. We can also overly focus on the metric, which is carbon. There are other things like the donut economic model showed that we have to think about. We have to think about the round of things when it comes to sustainability, and I'll come on to that a bit more shortly. The other metric in technology that we over-index on as well is something called PUE, which is power usage effectiveness. This is another classic example of what gets measured gets managed, because PUE is a benchmark that's used for data centers, and often the cloud providers are heralded as being amazingly efficient because they have a very low PUE, which basically means that for every bit of electricity going into the data center, we get very high rates of compute utilization of that power. We don't get lots of wastage. The problem with that metric is it doesn't take into account any of the water usage. And in fact, if you use more water, it can improve your PUE figure, because if you use electrical means of cooling, air conditioning and heat exchanging and so on and so forth, that goes against your PUE figure. But if you just pump lots of water through your system, then through your data center, that does not come off your PUE figure, and so it makes you look better than you actually are, because you may be good on electricity, but you may be absolutely terrible on water usage. And this is important because increasingly water is becoming a scarce commodity, particularly in water-stressed areas. And so come on to that again in a moment, but it's important for us. Basically, the point I'm making here is it's important for us to look at things in the round, not just fixate on CO2 or financial growth. And so we did a bit of work actually to sort of define what do we mean by holistically sustainable systems, and what is the target for most. I think the target is for most today, and it's this bigger picture of sustainability. Now, yes, sustainability is often associated with nature and the environment, but also sustainable business, and that's something, a process or a business being sustainable is also a use of that word. And I think it's fair to kind of put all those things together, including financial viability and financial sustainability, alongside environment, alongside technology challenges like technical debt, access to skills, security and risk management, and the sustainable, UN Sustainable Development Goals, which I'll touch on shortly. For me, all of these things, if you can try and find a win-win way of aligning these things, because by the way, if you get this right, it shouldn't cost you more to be sustainable. It should actually cost you less. You should be more frugal and more efficient with your use of resources. if you do it the right way. But my point at the bottom is we mustn't get stuck here, because this is just sustainability. And like I say, a lot of organizations can start pushing forwards beyond sustainability and looking at being restorative and regenerative. So the Sustainable Development Goals then. So hopefully a few of you have seen these. They came out, I think, in 2017 or so. There's 17 goals here. I won't go through all of them. The website's pretty decent, the links at the bottom right. There's a few that are directly linked to technology, and I'll come on to those in a minute. But I guess it's fair to say that most of these can be improved or impacted in some way through smart use of technology. And I'm not going to, as I say, I'm not going to focus too much on that for today's presentation. What I wanted to talk about was, as an architect, where do you need to start, and talk a bit about the defensive play. And what do I mean by this? I mean, as an architect, you need to think about your organization. What type of organization is it? When I say offense or defense, I mean, do you use technology, as I was just saying just now, to improve some of these, sustainability factors, some of these metrics, in your business operations at large? Or do you think about the impact that technology plays on sustainability and that defensive play? How do you minimize the impact technology has? Or do you go after the opportunities to optimize supply chains or manufacturing or other things that your organization does? And I think the key question here, the key answer to the question here is normally, it depends on what sector you're in. Are you a heavily industrial or physical process organization or company? Or are you largely in the knowledge economy or digital? So are you largely working with, information flows, or are you dealing with material flows? And if you're dealing with material flows and lots of logistics and supply chain, then you probably need to start thinking initially about where does architecture help optimize those things if it's not already. Where is the business architecture thinking about optimizing your capabilities for efficiency? But where is the process, optimization that reduces impact of processes? Where is supply chain optimization, and so on and so forth? So that's probably going to have a far bigger impact if you're a heavily industrial organization than anything you can do on the technology side. That said, if you're a knowledge economy business, you're largely digital, you're, say, in the financial sector, you're public sector, some public sector, that varies. But if you're largely office-based and you're largely knowledge worker-based, then you probably should be thinking quite a bit about your tech, because that probably makes up between 30 and 45% of your emissions is actually technology related. And we'll come on to what that looks like shortly. But this is a really important question for us all as architects, is what do I start with first? Because you can't answer all this. It's a really big space. It's a really big knotty problem area to get your head around, and you have to prioritize. So I think this is a big prioritization question for me around, do you start with the optimization of your business, or do you think about optimizing your use of technology? And so the rest of this presentation is going to focus more on the defense. I'd love in the future to have a conversation about, where tech can help optimize supply chains and so on. In fact, I'm doing other talks that touch more on that. But for this one, I wanted us to talk about tech impacts. And there's a bit of a wake-up moment, I suppose, here. There's a bit of the Matrix red pill, blue pill moment. Hopefully that reference lands, right? And, do you continue to accept the common narrative that digital is good and it's clean and it's not harmful? Or are you willing to kind of accept that, unfortunately, the realities of our technology usage are far more severe than perhaps we've been led to believe? So there's two sides of our use of technology, right? There is the force it can be for good, and I touched on that earlier. Can we optimize things? Can we reduce our paper usage? Can we reduce travel? Can we reduce commuting? Can we reduce business travel? Can we do meetings online, and so on and so forth? Of course, there's lots of positive impacts that technology can have. But we can't take away from the fact that technology, as much as we might try and kill ourselves, it's a virtual world, it's this sort of separate thing. It's not. It lives, in the physical realm. There are data centers, there are physical materials that are extracted out of the ground to make your smartphone. There is manufacturing processes to make your smartphone. There is a whole disposal process around, the waste once we dispose of our devices. There's real impacts there that, unfortunately, most people are just blissfully unaware of. And so part of this presentation is about pricking that bubble, really, and getting everyone to see the realities of our technology usage. And so going back to the UN SDGs, we did a bit of work that maps the UN SDGs to technology. What's the environmental impact? We did also do a bit of work by the way, around the people aspects, and there isn't time to cover that today, but there is a separate mapping exercise that others have done as well that talks about impact of people, because technology clearly has impact of people as well, like addictive algorithms, and so on and so forth. And the darker side of technology usage has impacts on people for sure, but parking that one for now for another time. If we look at the environmental impacts, the one that most people think about and gets talked about the most is the energy consumption. So it's this left-hand side. It's the, how much electricity is my technology using, and how clean is that electricity generation? So do we have, clean energy, and is it affordable? And so that there's sort of impacts on that side of things. But actually, that's only a small part of the picture. I mean, don't get me wrong, it can be significant for some types of device like servers, but actually for most consumer electronics, it's a very small, perhaps up to 20% consideration, versus actually what's known as the embodied impact. So the embodied carbon, or the processes that were involved in creating the hardware in the first place. Those processes are often far more energy intensive and materials impacting than the use of your device, particularly for phones, because a phone uses very little electricity. Charging a phone, it's hardly anything over its lifespan, but the manufacturing of that phone is significant, and the laptop, again, significant, versus the amount of electricity it consumes. So the narrative we're all being fed by the technology industry, that it's fine because the cloud is powered by renewable energy, and we'll just migrate everything to the cloud and everything will be good in the technology world and it has zero impact, is unfortunately not the full picture, right? It's part of the picture, but actually the reality is there's a whole lot of other physical impacts that I've mapped out here. And a big one is around our fast fashion for devices. This kind of constant rush to get a new device every 18 months to 2 years is horrendous from a sustainability standpoint. We have to start using our devices for longer. We have to start reusing them, repairing them, and making sure they certainly don't go to landfill, that those devices are being disposed of thoughtfully and reused where they can be. Because this has impacts. There are impacts to waste materials, impacting and polluting water sources, impacting and polluting land. And I touched on earlier water used to cool data centers as well. There's other impacts that are massive use of technology, and this is only growing with AI, and I'll touch on that a bit more in a moment. We have to get real, basically, about the impact that technology has on the real world, because it does have an impact on the real world, as much as we may try and kid ourselves that it's this virtual thing, this ephemeral cloud concept that doesn't have any real physical home. It definitely does have a real physical home. We just don't see it, and we're increasingly abstracted away from it by the suppliers that we're using. So I wanted to talk about how so I guess it's possibly been a bit doom and gloom there, so sorry about that, but I wanted to kind of just give you a bit of a reality check about what's going on. But what I want to do now is start to talk about some of the pragmatic things that we can do as architects to identify where the significant areas are of the technology landscape, because again, we can have our view somewhat skewed by the marketing messages that we receive. And so what I wanted to kind of share with you is a piece of work that we've open sourced, and it's called the Technology Carbon Standard, and it's available online at techcarbonstandard.org, and it's also on GitHub as well. We're very open to contributions and corrections and issues on the GitHub project. But this has been live for a few months now, and we've got great feedback, and we're working with quite a few people on it. And the reason it's helpful is that up until we define this, we really struggled to find a standardized way of classifying the impact technology has from and this, by the way, is a little bit carbon centric right now. We are going to make it broader than that, but it's a starting point. And what we've done is we've mapped this, for those of you that are familiar with the greenhouse gas, the GHG protocol scopes, we've mapped this to scopes 1, 2, and 3. And so the idea here is we look at those upstream emissions, the emissions that are involved in the creation of hardware, and those embodied emissions. We look at the operational emissions, and we look at the downstream emissions. The downstream emissions being the use of the technology by our customers, and the operational emissions being what do we use to run and operate the technology that we have, either directly, so that's category O, which the O kind of stands for on-premise really, and those are the devices and servers and things that we're running ourselves. If we've got backup power generators or electricity generation in some parts of the world where the grid isn't reliable, that's category G, and that's scope 1 if it's burning fossil fuels or creating emissions in the process of creating that electricity. Otherwise, for most organizations these days, category C is a really interesting area. C stands for cloud. And it's not just cloud, but it's also, you know, managed services and other things like that, that you're not directly running the technology, but an organization is on your behalf. So there's like this indirect you know, emissions as a result. So yeah, what we've done here is split up the world, carve it up, and help, because for some organizations, different parts of this picture grow and shrink. And one of the things we're working on right now is an estimator, so that you can put in information about your organization, and these things will grow and shrink and help you heat map essentially, where is the impact that technology has in your organization, and therefore what do you target, what do you focus on as an architect, what principles maybe do you put in policies or guide rails for projects and future change that helps address some of these things. So mapping is the start. You have to think about the measurement of those, not overly obsessing about the measurement, enough measurements that you can understand, you know, is it significant, and am I tracking in the right direction? Mitigation is what we need to move to as rapidly as possible, right? Once we've understood our impacts, how do we mitigate and manage and reduce those? And then just before I finish and turn over to sort of Q&A, I just wanted to talk through a couple of practical things. I mean, as architects, we love our principles, and the Green Software Foundation has some really nice, kind of clear, simple principles. And I love them, but I also like to layer on top some added win-win benefits. I talked at the beginning about ideally sustainability should be win-win-win. It should be cheaper, it should be more sustainable, you know, reduce risk, and it should be cleaner and greener. And I think there's some great examples of where thinking, you know, efficiency really drives also security benefits. So simpler solutions are often more secure, simply because they're less complicated, they have less, you know, vectors for attack, less attack surface. And the same is true of running less hardware. If you can run a more efficient system and run it on less hardware and prune your estate, manage those zombie servers out, get rid of them, turn stuff off, you've got less of an attack surface from a hardware standpoint. So not only have you reduced the amount of energy, and ideally, if you don't need to buy new hardware, that's reducing embodied carbon as well, you can also minimize your security attack surface. And then finally, there's this other concept, this principle of carbon awareness, which I'll just come on to a bit more detail in a second as my last point. Can you run your workloads so that you do more when electricity is clean and do less when things are dirty? You know, doing that in many cases promotes adaptability and resilience and flexibility in your architecture, because if you're, you know, scheduling jobs and you're running parts of your platforms, you know, at different times, you potentially got some more adaptability and resilience and the ability to do sort of failover and move things from one region to another. So we shouldn't just look at these things as just green, you know, that there are other hard benefits and soft benefits that we get from doing these things. So just quickly, because I'm conscious of time, lots of talk right now about carbon aware, and it's really interesting as a concept. And actually, tomorrow I'm doing an event with Green Tech Southwest, and we're going to be talking a bit about this. And we're recording a podcast actually, which will be coming out fairly soon, which talks about carbon aware. And Hannah from Green Web Foundation has put out an interesting paper on grid aware. So basically, the technology industry is talking a lot about, can we run workloads when the grid looks cleaner? And long story short, the reality is, unfortunately, that's possibly an overly simplistic metric to use when deciding when to schedule our jobs, because if we applied it at scale, we may actually have the reverse impact. And we won't go into all the ins and outs, but essentially this electricity maps picture on the right is a lovely picture. It shows you how, you know, dirty or clean the grid is, the electricity grid is at any given time. The trouble is it's far more nuanced than that. And your workload, your data center or your cloud hosting isn't the average of the country. It's a specific nuanced part of the country that needs to be kept in balance. And to keep it in balance, if you add demand, potentially you bring online gas or worst case in some parts of the world, coal-fired power stations to keep that grid in balance. So, you know, overloading areas of Europe that look clean could potentially have an adverse, you know, reverse impact. So really what we need to do is make software that's grid aware, that's aware of the demands placed on the grid and knows how much capacity there is. So for example, how much wind is currently being switched off and disconnected from the grid because there's too much of it. Well, actually, if I can start consuming electricity there, then yes, I'm going to be using more renewable. I'm going to be using a wasted renewable resource. So yes, let's start ramping up workloads in areas where there's plenty of clean energy available, but let's not do that in areas where we'd end up having to switch on a gas turbine or something else that's not as clean. So I I'm running out of time to cover AI. Maybe we can do that in the Q&A. But it's a double-edged sword. Of course, using AI offensively to find more efficient ways of working and operating, new battery materials or optimizing resource usage. Fantastic. AI can be a force for good. But of course, AI is currently being pushed as like the answer to almost everything. And that's not sustainable, not sustainable financially. These organizations that are running these platforms, it's expensive, not just financially, but it uses a lot of power, a lot of water to cool the AI, not only the training of the models, but also the inferencing and the running of the models. It's a big, power-hungry operation, an expensive operation right now. And so these things are going to be expensive in the medium to longer term. And therefore, we're going to have to be quite frugal and frugal about our use of AI. And lazy use of AI needs to be really questioned. We need to be applying it to the things that it really it adds value to, because it's going to come under the spotlight pretty soon. I'm pretty sure of that. We're already seeing these articles about this, and the rampant growth of power of data center operators is coming under fire, and quite rightfully. And so we're going to have to be conscientious about our use of AI going forwards. I love AI, don't get me wrong. I think used for the right things, it's great, but we just need to be a little bit more conscientious. And I think as architects, we're in a really good place to advise our organizations on how to do that. So rattled through a lot of stuff there. I appreciate that. But here's a bit of a recap and points that we can now jump into a bit of a Q&A if those of you who are able to stick around a bit longer to discuss. I think there is an opportunity here as much as there is a risk. There are ways for organizations to reimagine how they operate, and that provides masses of opportunity. I think they're going to see a lot of change and a lot of opportunities come in the market as a result of needing to sort of shift to a more sustainable and regenerative approaches. I'll just cite a quick example. There's a really interesting organization called Deep Green, and they are using the waste heat from data centers to heat swimming pools and potentially provide community heating. Really smart use of waste heat in a circular economy kind of way, right? So we need to run data centers, but why do we just vent the heat to the atmosphere? Why don't we, or to the water system? Why don't we use that waste heat for as a source of heat for something that needs it? So a really interesting example of how we can use these things as opportunities rather than as a risk or a cost. The second thing for me, a big one, is this provides yet another rationale, if we need one, for why architecture and why enterprise architecture, quite frankly. Why do we need to think bigger picture? Why do we need to think about the ecosystem of where we sit within our supply chain and other things like that? I think this provides a really big drive for thinking more systems and more architecturally in our organizations. Point number 3, I'd urge you to try and make sustainability a first-class citizen like we have security, and that's what we need to do. That's the big priority. We have to educate. We have to make people aware of what's going on out there, right? Particularly with tech usage, but also, there's going to be some uncomfortable conversations we're going to have about the real impact some of our organizations have on the world, and how do we adjust that? And so we have to face into those scary conversations with stakeholders and have pragmatic conversations about how we move forward. We can't all of a sudden do drastic knee-jerk things. Of course we can't, but we have to be started to look at how we steer the ship onto a more sustainable course for our organizations. And ideally, once you get closer to sustainability, you need to start adjusting your target. Much like architects we like to do this. The roadmap has a target state, but the reality is we never really get to that target state. We just shift the roadmap out, and we find a new target. We need to adjust our targets to regeneration and restorative, when we're in a position that we can do that sensibly. Talked about this just now, thinking about AI. Do you really need massive, big AI models that are really expensive to run, or can you run smaller models, or do you need AI at all? Is actually a more efficient logic-based system right now good enough? It's not to say ignore innovation. Of course, we need to keep an eye on innovation as architects and advise our organizations, but we also need to caution against sort of just applying, the overhyped technology. Just look at blockchain from a few years ago, right? We have to kind of reel in the hype somewhat. Use it where it makes sense to do so. I'm not saying don't use AI. I'm just saying we need to be smart about our application of AI. And the last one I would say is, as architects, we need to be conscientious in what we do and the perhaps unintended consequences of what we do. I think there's some classic examples here of being somewhat imprecise about data retention periods, for example, or constantly pushing for 5 nines availability. You know, these things have knock-on impacts on cost and on, you know, the impact of energy consumption and resource consumption. So do we really need everything to be at like gold-plated standard or gold standard? Can some things be silver and bronze and reduce their impact and reduce their cost to the organizations that we work for? So that is me done. You know, the Tech Carbon Standard website's here. I'm working, as I say, with ISA on their business technology architecture body of knowledge on the sustainability topic. Happy to kind of work with anyone who's equally got a passion for this topic on that. Do connect with me on LinkedIn if we're not already connected, and let's have a discussion. But otherwise, I'll come back to these discussion points really and start to look at the chat and Q&A. And apologies, unless someone has joined since. I am still running one-man band, so let me go and look at the chat and Q&A, and we'll make this more interactive. So yes, it is being recorded. Okay. Apologies, lots of people telling me I did not share my slides. So first question from David: have you looked at other projects and what was your evaluation of other projects? Yeah, no, we have looked at a range of different projects and other sources. That one, Linux Foundation Energy, I think, is that? Yeah, so we're working with, so the Green Software Foundation is part of the Linux Foundation. So I'm pretty sure that the Green Software Foundation piece builds on some of the Linux Foundation Energy pieces, but thank you for that. I will definitely take a look at that. That's not one specifically that I have seen. Petra, how and when are you introducing the non-financial arguments in organizations, and who do you target? Strategy versus as part of the change delivery, etc. Financial is, of course, easier, although cost can be a real obstruction to get change approved. Yeah, I mean, like I said, Petra, for me, this works best when you can try and align the two. So when you can find cost reduction and sustainability improvements. Yeah, it doesn't always work that way. I mean, a classic example of this is when we work with some organizations, moving to a cleaner cloud region, for example, isn't always going to be lower cost. That sometimes is a cost. So so yes, no, I agree. Like, cost can be a real obstruction getting change approved. I think yeah, it's not an easy kind of, you probably have to do the classic architect, it depends response, right? I think it depends on who the stakeholders are and what levers work for them. Ishmael, great to hear you mention grid awareness. If that's the Ishmael, I think it is. Hi Ishmael, thanks for joining. Another one from Petra. In Netherlands, they are asking cars not to charge the grid as it's overloading, and I can imagine data centers getting restricted as well. Yeah, that's a really interesting point. So one of the really interesting things that's happening now is data center grid approvals are taking quite a long time. So if you want a new data center in London, my understanding is you're waiting for quite a long time. I think I even heard 5 years or something crazy like that, because yeah, there isn't the capacity to add that, and clearly they're having to plan for EV charging and heat pumps and other electricity usage. It's not to say the grid doesn't have the capacity. It's just as we move to renewable sources of energy, it's harder to balance right now. So we're going through this transition period, and I think as we're going through the transition period, the distribution just isn't there. So in many cases, we have the generation, we just don't have the distribution to get it to where it needs to be. So yeah, it's certainly going to be an interesting one the next few years for like electricity grid connections for data centers and other things. New laws were passed in Singapore on data centers, basically no new licenses. Ishmael was saying. David Bauer, for a given cloud service, providers often offer different variations of that service, which attract different costs, e.g. AWS EC2 with different configs and different costs. They also have different pricing for spot usage, which provides services on excess capacity. Question: does the price of the cloud service offering provide a proxy for the better maximization of the data center's capacity and hence better, greener usage of the capacity that the data center provides? Okay, so I think that, in other words, what you're saying is cost. Does cost tell you whether you're using an efficient resource or not? And if it's lower cost, is it more efficient because it's being shared more? Quite possibly. I think that doesn't perhaps take into consideration the cost of the electricity, and cleaner electricity isn't always cheap. So I think I mean, ideally it should be, but it depends on how the market is pricing. So for example, in the UK, we price electricity on the most expensive form of generation. So it doesn't always work that yeah, the cost is a proxy. In some cases it does. I mean, one of the bits of advice we give is, if you're not able to measure environmental footprint, start looking at cost, and because you can broadly approximate costs for environmental impact. It does break, but I think if you don't have anything else to start with, it's not a bad place to start to look at the kind of costs of different things as a proxy. But it's a bit nuanced, so I would say approach with caution on that one. Enzo says it's not up to architects to decide first and second class citizens. Those are business priorities. Well, yeah, no, I'd agree with you. Architects aren't there to make the decisions, but we're there to surface up the decisions and the options that are out there. I think we have to advocate for sustainability. But you're right, if the organization doesn't view them as a, and by the way, I would say architects need to see themselves as part of the business, not the business as a separate thing. And that's possibly a slightly separate debate. But no, I think we should advocate for it. And if our organizations aren't including sustainability as a non-functional or a quality attribute, we should be advocating for those things. And if we're not prioritizing that, we can at least make visible those impacts. Excuse me, Petra. With the restrictions you mentioned on data grid licenses, will we start seeing monopoly positions develop for existing providers? Should there be more global legislation and fair trade arrangements around that? Really interesting point. Hadn't thought about that one, Petra. Quite possibly. I mean, I think what we will see is cloud getting more expensive. I think we're already starting to see that. I think that's only going to continue, right? As demand for compute increases, and of course, it's not just CPU we're talking about now, it's GPU as well. So I think as demands for, that data center space and compute grows, I think costs will, inevitably rise. So yeah, I think there's going to be some really interesting sort of challenges emerging in that regard. But hopefully it will also start to sort of open up different parts of the world as potential sort of hosts. We don't have to host everything really low latency and really close to our users, right? Machine learning model training, for example, can be done pretty much anywhere in the world as long as it's within data governance and data legislation. So yeah, I think we have to start thinking a bit more creatively about where we run compute. We don't necessarily have all our compute sitting right next door to where we are or where the users are. So that was the chat comments. Let me go to Q&A. So David says, for when it's appropriate to answer, any suggestions on ways to approach sustainability as part of enterprise architecture in culture/economies that are very focused on capitalism/profits versus a more balanced, holistic approach? I'm based in the US. So David, I'm glad you asked this one. And I guess maybe what I'll do is I'll jump back to the picture I had right at the start, or this one, where essentially the reason I put this picture together is I actually spent quite a bit of time working with US stakeholders and friends and colleagues, and actually the financial argument for some is more compelling, right? And sometimes we just have to find the cheaper and cleaner way of doing something and showing that that's the way that we can do more sustainable business. And so yeah, you're right, in some cultures you're going to need to talk to what moves the lever, and unfortunately in many cases that's pure financials, but you can do that in a way that it is hopefully win-win. And I think the other thing is to start pricing in the externalities. Though at some point these externalities will bite. We can't use virgin materials for forever. At some point we're going to have to get real about how we start remanufacturing and recycling and so on and so forth. So I guess it depends, right, on what you're looking to optimize, whether it's the offensive piece I talked about, whether it's the defensive piece. But in many cases, it's just more efficient and lower cost to be sustainable, right? To sweat assets longer, to think about, do we really need to store all this data, to challenge certain requirements, are they really required or are they nice to have? So it's just poking and prodding, I think, in many cases, a lot of the assumptions that we've built over time, and looking, can we unpick those to reduce cost and make things more sustainable. So I'm conscious of time. Did anyone want to jump on and discuss? We haven't got super lots of people. We've got about 30 or so people, so we have got the opportunity for others to jump on who have other points of view or want to challenge or have a point they want to make. Otherwise, if I don't see anything else in the chat or anyone raising hands or anything, I think we'll probably wrap up in the next couple of minutes. But here's your opportunity to table anything, and I'll yeah, Gavin, I'll find you on the list, and this is where my lack of ability to use Zoom lets me down. Where are you, Gavin? Apologies, bear with me. Gavin, I've unmuted you, or I should have unmuted you. There you go. Gavin, can you hear me? I think you should be able to talk now. Okay. You can't unmute at your end. Okay, let me. I've just tried to unmute you again. I don't know if the BCS organizer is on the line and can help Gavin unmute. Gavin, do you want to try and unmute? Okay. Okay, your point is about how do we sweat assets and do this safely? Yeah, no, you're right. It's a trade-off, isn't it? Because if we sweat assets too long, they start to break. And if they're part of a critical service that we're offering, then that's bad. So yeah, no, totally take your point there. It's a trade-off. And so I'm not suggesting that we do that. But if you look at how lots of the cloud providers are doing it, they're using commodity hardware and they're tolerating a lot more failure. And so I think, there's a few things we can do here. There is, can we run our data centers at a higher temperature? There are many organizations that have experimented with that and found that they can. And we can potentially sweat our assets for longer, particularly if we have high levels of redundancy and high availability and so on. So it's a risk trade-off, of course it is. And I think for high critical services, then yes, you may choose to be lower risk in that regard, but for other services, you might find that. And the other thing, I guess, is things like, does everything, or does all your storage need to be hot? There's a lot of really easy things we can do here around, moving to like a hot, warm, cold sort of storage strategy. Thanks, Ishmael, around your reference to Sustain magazine out of Germany doing good work on AI and sustainability, part of Algorithm Watch. Yeah. Sorry for cutting short the AI piece. I probably had a bit too much content. And also thank you to Andrew for correcting my point about helium, which he says is a byproduct of nuclear decay. So as long as we have radioactive materials in the ground, new helium will be produced. That's not to say we shouldn't use what we have carefully and prioritize healthcare, MRI machines, etc., over party balloons. Okay, thank you for correcting me, because the papers I read said that most of the helium, isn't going to be replenished. So thank you for correcting me there. Hopefully that will provide a reasonable replenishment for our helium, because we certainly want MRI machines in the future. Okay. All right. Thanks, Mike. Otherwise, I'm not seeing anything new coming in. We seem to be struggling with unmuting people. Apologies for that. But I think I answered your point anyway, Gavin. Yeah, so we're at kind of 25 past the hour, unless anyone else wants to jump in with anything, or the BCS organizer can help us unmute Gavin or anyone else. I think what we will do is wrap up. So thanks everyone for joining. We run these fairly regularly. We're the organising committee of the EA group has been re-established recently, so we are now planning new events and new sessions later in the year. So do look out for more events from us. And with that, thanks very much for attending. And look, if you wanted to kind of raise something that you didn't get an opportunity to do so, then do reach out to me on LinkedIn. Or come to one of the BCS events in the future and raise it there. One thing I should say is we're planning our conference again this year for September, so do look out for that. Pencil, that in your we don't have an exact September date yet, but that's when the annual EA conference will be. We try and keep it pretty low cost. So I think last year it was about £25–30. So I think it's one of the lowest cost enterprise architecture conferences around. And yeah, and with that, thanks very much, everyone. This was recorded for those of you asking about that, and I will almost certainly share the deck. If you want it, yeah, ping me, and I'll ping that across. I'll probably most certainly be pinging it on LinkedIn fairly shortly, so look out for it there. All right, everyone. Thanks very much, and see you all in the future, hopefully.